Quite often, I find myself, late at night, thinking about random and odd things. And of course, me being me, I decide to investigate my thoughts and find myself deep down the rabbit hole to a point in which I wish I never started. Rather than my brain hurt alone, I decided to bring you all with me. Bring you on an adventure on where serving sizes and nutrition labels come from. Trust me, it's weird. How they were created, how they are part of a vicious cycle that feeds into itself, and how food labels are not always as they seem will be discussed and investigated this episode. For most of human history as a whole, we have lived very much hand to mouth. An abundance of food wasn't always a thing. That was until the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution came around, when mass producing started to become the standard. The agricultural boom, because of machines, caused more food to be planted, harvested, and transported than there's ever been. So much so that people began to produce pre-made food on mass scale. Yes. Pre-made food was done in history, with different cultures and items. But nothing like this. The idea of the general public going to a location and buying an entire meal or meals that was already made to bring home to have at a later time was extremely new. And a caveat I want to make about this episode is many things are simplified. There is a lot of moving pieces and history to food and the economy dealing with food. That out of the way, back to the story. Pre-packaged meals and food in the early days were a new frontier. No regulation, no standards, no limitations. Because of this, a lot of snake oil meals were being produced. Meals that promised healing for certain ailments. And, for the most part, you never were quite sure what you were buying is what you're getting, or at least what it says in the title. So, in America, the government decided, like usual, to get involved. For a good reason this time. The U.S. government would make the FDA, Food and Drugs Administration, in 1906. Mainly due to unhygienic conditions and disgusting ways food were being handled and mass-produced, but the initial focus of the FDA at this new time was to regulate how food was handled and the conditions produced, less about what was in the food, and less even more so than what the label said. Granted, rules and regulations were heavily suggested, not always followed, but for a time it would improve. And it wouldn't be until 1938 when the FDA started to really put pen to paper. In 1938, the FDA made the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and in this act closed many loopholes for companies about hiding what was in their food, drugs, and makeup. And some of the claims that these companies were claiming about their food, well, the FDA would put in the act, and I quote, fails to reveal facts, material, and the light of such representation. In other words, the FDA was tired of snake oil along with the rest of America. But then World War II came, and well, basically, nobody cared how you got food or exactly what was in it, as long as it was food and it was edible. After World War II, life for the most part, for a stint, went back to how it was before the war, in making and buying food, standards at least. Most homes, if not basically every home, mainly cooked at home. Eating out was more of a special treat. Tons of homemade from scratch meals, but tons of homemade from scratch meals were the commonplace. But the machine kept turning, and the wakes created from the Industrial Revolution kept rippling out. Pre-made food and ingredients were now more common. Cereal, soda, pre-made sandwiches, and with the invention of the microwave, a new series of frozen food. All of these items ready to go directly to your stomach, with little to no preparation or work needed. Because of this ease of food consumption, more people were buying pre-made things rather than making things. For example, buying pasta instead of making pasta. Though pasta has been manufactured since the 17th century in its pre-made form, again, This is a complicated subject, so allow me some oversimplifications. For some countries, they had a new problem: an abundance of food and an easy lifestyle with pre-made food ready for the masses. So, in the United States, during the late 1960s, early 1970s, the government decided that the best way for people to regulate and make intelligent food choices was to force companies to put a nutrition label on consumable items. So, in 1972, the nutrition label idea was introduced, and by 1973, laws about nutrition labels went into effect. Now this label, heavy quotations on the label, had lots of loopholes and openings for interpretation on the law of what a nutrition label is and needed. It was the beginning towards the nutrition label that we all know today. Even with the new information for the American people, knowing how many servings were in the food that they bought, the ingredients, etc., Americans were still getting bigger, eating more, and buying more pre-made food. Companies that were producing such food were skirting along the edges. I mean, hate the game, not the player, so I kind of understand that. And once again, because of this, the government would return to the FDA for a solution. So the FDA would dive into more research and set a guideline that the government would vote on and implement. You may ask yourself, can the FDA make laws, or are they just more advisors to the government? The answer would be yes. The FDA is a complicated red tape clusterfuck of government bureaucracy. Hell, the FDA, the Food Drug Administration, only regulates 75% of the U.S. food supply. So, for the most part, the FDA lives in an internal gray zone of what they can and can't do. The FDA would look at and look for information that would deem important to those who consume the products and could easily be understood by the American people. So in the 1990s, the Nutrition Label and Education Act, NLEA, would be made. An act to try to remedy the holes in the older documents, such as the act made in 1938, we talked about earlier, with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This new Nutrition Labeling and Education Act would go into effect in 1991, but only affect already regulated FDA items. It wouldn't be until 1993 when it was all consumable items, at least consumable items under FDA guidelines. Important to point out, this is all for packaged food, not for restaurants. That will come later. The new act would make companies to use common household measuring sizes. So, companies now had to use measurements in teaspoons, cups, etc., and also had to write out the number of servings per container, number of calories per serving based on total fat and saturated fat. They also had to write the amount of fat, the amount of sodium, the sugar, the protein, etc., and all the vitamins and minerals in it. Now, the Nutrition Label and Education Act moves slow, and it's difficult to determine how much a serving size and percentage of each ingredient is considered a daily dose. At this point, you probably think to yourself that scientists conducted studies, trying to figure out how much the average person needed, what is a healthy amount, like scientists should. And you would be dead wrong. You see, people vary in size, age, sex, genetics, activity level, a lot of variables. So the FDA and basically all manufacturers decided to take the fast route. They would look at the reference amount customarily consumed, RACC. Now, RACCS were food studies conducted between 1977 and 1978 and 1987 and 1988. These studies, the RACCs, were tracking on how much the average person consumed, not how much they should consume. And since it was an approved guideline for the nutrition label, it could be used to determine the appropriate information on the food label, which is now by law something companies have to do. Again, this is not how much is healthy for you, but how much of your predecessors from decades earlier ate this specific food. Just for reference, society, people, and businesses change a lot. And what used to be common and done a certain way can easily change. Like, for example, food. So when the RACCs were recording how much a person averagely consumed in one sitting, it might be different than, say, a few more decades into the future with a new generation and a new population. Not to mention, the food itself might have changed, the ingredients, the preparation steps, the new methods of creating it. Hell, in the 1970s, a cheeseburger had around 330 calories. Today, it's closer to 600. Pizza in the past used to be about 500 calories. Now it's about 850 calories. So when you have all your basings, all your serving sizes, and percentages of ingredients, not off what the average person should consume, but rather what people did consume decades ago, might not be the best idea. Hell, the FDA itself defines serving size as, and I quote, amount of food customarily consumed in one sitting for that food, end quote. It's gonna cause some issues in the American diet with that kind of mindset. Oh, important little tidbit of information. Most serving sizes, besides baby food and infant food, is based on ages 4 years and older. Yeah, the percentage for a serving size, which are calculated by how much a person eats in one sitting, are made up with a 4-year-old or older, all sexes, all activity levels, from all different backgrounds. That might just cause the average to be screwed up a little bit, but what do I know? Not to mention that a portion size is very different than a serving size. A portion size is how much you eat in a serving by quantity and volume, not a serving size, which is how much different people ate the same food decades ago. And, pay to boot, while all this is happening, companies are manufacturing, marketing, and strategizing to get more sales and more consumption of their products. Like, for example, changing plate sizes and making glasses bigger so you consume more but think you are eating and drinking less. A perfect storm, so to speak. Yeah, the science of food and kitchenware is completely complex in its own industry. I don't want to get into it, but keep that in mind. Eventually, the 21st century rolled around, and people realized Americans are getting fatter. What on earth is happening? How do we stop this? The average of eating out rather than cooking at home had increased dramatically, so much so that in 2012, chain restaurants, just chains, now had to post how much calories was in their meal. Though the idea was well intended, that didn't really do much. So, in 2016, the FDA and the government decided to do a massive overhaul and try to recalculate serving sizes and laws dealing with nutrition labels. Decided to use the RACCs again, this time based on data between 2003 and 2008, the time when Americans truly, on mass scale, began to overeat and have obesity problems. They decided serving sizes based on how much people averagely ate during one of the fattest times in America, where they ate based off previous serving sizes, which were based off historical average made decades earlier. A vicious cycle. I can't believe people are this dumb. I believe that the government to be this dumb, but someone in those board meetings had to think to themselves, no, this doesn't make sense. Why are we doing this? With the new regulations, companies now had to show individual and entire container serving sizes and percentages. The FDA made Article 101.12, which is a reference amount customarily consumed per eating occasion. Their words, not mine. And I think it's a great time to mention, there is no data that confirms or denies that serving sizes on food containers help or mitigate health problems. Research has been done, and there are articles about it, but for the most part, all of the papers, data is unclear. It varied and occasionally contradicted each other's research. So all this labeling and figures seem to be all for naught from what I could tell. Also in 2016 through 2018, with the huge overhaul, dual columns for nutrition labels were introduced. A column for single serving and a column for the entire container. Apparently, people were too lazy or dumb to do the math themselves, so the government had to make rules about it. Along with now chain restaurants, along with that, now chains have to have nutrition information about their items. And in the eyes of FDA, chain restaurants is a restaurant with 20 or more locations. And the FDA during this period had to come up and decide a whole new slew of definitions. Definitions? What on earth is he talking about? Let me explain. Remember how I said businesses adapt to help sell more products? Well, they started using words like low, free, reduced, healthy, light, good source, lean. The list goes on and on. The companies can't make giant health claims, but they can market it to seem so. In return, the FDA had to come up with all these definitions of these words when they are related to food, so that the companies didn't mislead or mislabel. This, in my mind, and I imagine in reality, is an astronomically hard thing to do. Imagine defining the word light used to describe food. Now, you need to make a definition that would cover vast amounts of food, different types, everything from single ingredients to whole meals, and it also has to cover the category of drinks. A tall task. Also, as a company, how much you sell and how simple the item is changes the laws associated with labeling your product. As though this wasn't already complicated enough. Single ingredients, like honey, sugar, etc., that are just sold as individuals, have their own regulations compared to something like ramen or a frozen meal. And that is not counting single serving meals. When you have single serving meals that are just one meal, one serving, they have their complete own subset of regulations that they have to pass, completely different from single ingredient items to multiple serving items. Yes, there is overlap, but there are more rules for each category. And that brings us to present day, where things still don't make sense. The nutrition label is still wrong. It's based on data with so many variables, it's basically useless. And based on figures from how much people consume, not how much people should consume. Not to mention, portion sizes are just made up. It just depends on what era you're born in. And when it comes to international or foreign countries compared to America, forget about it. Way above my pay level. This is a whole conspiracy theory that I went far down the rabbit hole more than I should. So in short, serving sizes most likely means it's not the right size for you. The laws and science used to determine the serving size is flawed, if not just plain out wrong. What you should consume and how much, well, you're just going to have to do your own research. Figure out your personal variables and go from there. I'm sorry I can't tell you how much is the right amount for you, but I know it makes me feel better that the US government tries to figure it out and even they can't get it right. Food science and culture is weird. The laws and regulation around it is also weird. But I hope I got to shed some light on where serving sizes and nutrition labels come from. And I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned that when it comes to your own health, you have to take it in your own hands, not just with the label that the government forces companies to print on it. And with that being said, thank you all for listening.